All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Grail Country. I titled this A Conversation with Jed, and I think I put in the description that we're going to tackle sermon number 2 from Meister Eckhart. Ron, meet Jed. Jed.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and share that. That is a really good question, Ron. I mean, we could talk about that. Really, this is what the new conversation is going to be all about. We're pushing Meister Eckhart and all the spiritual conversations aside and just answering what is or who is Jed. Shari, who is Jed?
Oh, gosh. Well, I would be the last person to know that, actually.
I know, me, same here.
But anyway, because I was delinquent in my duties, I thought that I would just read through the sermon first because, well, I think it's helpful for everyone watching. And, well, there's nobody watching at the moment, but that's okay. And then it would also give me a chance to read it.
There we go.
Okay, let's get started.
Sounds like me when I was in college. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, did you do the reading? I'm doing it right now. We're good.
It'll only take me a minute. Zing, zing, zing. Yeah. Okay, I'm not good at Latin, but he has in Latin. I'm going to try it. Ubi est qui or K. How do you say that? Qui.
Qui, I think.
Qui.
Yeah, I think.
Ubi est qui natus est rex Judaeorum. Anyway, it's Matthew 2:2. Do you know what that verse says in English?
Yes, it is. It's the quoted verse. Your next.
Oh, the next one. Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm showing all my cards here. Where is he who is born King of the Jews? Now observe as regards this birth, where it takes place. Where is he who is born? Now I say, as I have often said before, that this eternal birth occurs in the soul precisely as it does in eternity, no more and no less, for it is one birth. And this birth occurs in the essence and ground of the soul. Now certain questions arise. First of all, since God is in all things as intelligence, and is more truly in them than they are in themselves, and more naturally, and since wherever God is, there he must work, knowing himself and speaking his word, in what special respects, then, is the soul better fitted for this divine operation than are other rational creatures in which God also is? And then he says, pay attention to the explanation.
Mm-hmm.
God is in all things as being, as activity, as power, but he is fecund in the soul alone. For though every creature is a vestige of God, the soul is the natural image of God. This image must be adorned and perfected in this birth. No creature but the soul alone is receptive to this act, this birth. Indeed, such perfection as enters the soul, whether it be divine, undivided light, grace, or bliss, must enter the soul through this birth, and in no other way. Just await this birth within you, and you shall experience all good and all comfort, all happiness, all being, and all truth. If you miss it, you will miss all good and blessedness. Whatever comes to you in that will bring you pure being and stability. But whatever you seek or cleave to apart from this will perish. Take it how you will and where you will, all will perish. This alone gives being, all else perishes. But in this birth you will share in the divine influx and all its gifts. This cannot be perceived by creatures in which God's image is not found. For the soul's image appertains especially to this eternal birth, which happens truly and especially in the soul, being begotten of the Father in the soul's ground and innermost recesses, into which no image has ever shone, or soul power peeped. He keeps repeating this, right? It's only found in the soul. The second question is, since this work of birth occurs in the essence and ground of the soul, then it happens just as much in a sinner as in a saint. So what grace or good is there in it for me? For the ground of nature is the same in both. In fact, even those in hell retain their nobility of nature eternally. Now note the answer. It is a property of this birth that it always comes with fresh light. It always brings a great light to the soul, for it is the nature of good to diffuse itself wherever it is. In this birth, God streams into the soul in such abundance of life, so flooding the essence and ground of the soul that it runs over and floods into the powers and into the outward man. Thus it befell Paul, when on his journey God touched him with his light and spoke to him. A reflection of the light shone outwardly, so that his companions saw it surrounding Paul like the blessed in heaven. The superfluity of light in the ground of the soul wells over into the body, which is filled with radiance. No sinner can receive this light, nor is he worthy to, being full of sin and wickedness, which is called darkness. Therefore it says, the darkness shall neither receive nor comprehend the light. John 1:5. That is because the paths by which the light would enter are choked and obstructed with guile and darkness, for light and darkness cannot coexist. Or God and creatures. If God shall enter, the creatures must simultaneously go out. A man is fully aware of this light. Directly he turns to God, a light begins to gleam and glow within him, giving him to understand what to do and what to leave undone, with much true guidance in regards to things of which before he knew or understood nothing. Where do you know this from, and in what way? Just pay attention. Your heart is often moved and turned away from the world. How could that be but by this illumination? It is so charming and delightful that you become weary of all things that are not God or gods. It draws you to God, and you become aware of many a prompting to do good, though ignorant of whence it comes. This inward inclination is in no way due to creatures or their bidding, for what creatures direct or affect always comes from without. But by this work, it is only the ground of the soul that is stirred, and the freer you keep yourself, the more light, truth, and discernment you will find. Thus no man ever went astray for any other reason than he first departed from this, and then sought too much to cling to outward things. St. Augustine says there are many who sought light and truth, but only outside where it was not to be found. Finally, they go out so far that they never get back home or find their way in again. Thus they have not found the truth, for truth is within, in the ground, and not without. So he who would see light to discern all truth, let him watch and become aware of this birth within, in the ground. Then all his powers will be illuminated. Excuse me. When he talks about powers, he's talking about the senses. Then all his powers will be illuminated, and the outer man as well. For as soon as God inwardly stirs the ground with truth, its light darts into his powers, that man knows at times more than anyone could teach him. As the prophet says, I have gained greater understanding than all who ever taught me. You see then, because this light cannot shine or lighten in sinners, that is why this birth cannot possibly occur in them. This birth cannot coexist with the darkness of sin, even though it takes place not in the powers, but in the essence and ground of the soul. The question arises, since God the Father gives birth only in the essence and ground of the soul, and not in the powers, what concern is it of theirs? How do they help, just by being idle and taking a rest? What is the use, since this birth does not take place in the powers? A good question. Listen well to the explanation. Every creature works towards some end. The end is always the first in intention, but the last in execution. Thus, too, God in all his works has a most blessed end in view, namely himself, to bring the soul and all her powers into that end, himself. For this, all God's works are wrought. For this, the Father bears his Son in the soul, so that all the powers of the soul shall come to this. He lies in wait for all that the soul contains, bidding all to this feast at his court. But the soul is scattered abroad among her powers, and dissipated in the action of each, the power of sight in the eye, the power of hearing in the ear, the power of tasting in the tongue. Thus her ability to work inwardly is enfeebled, for a scattered power is imperfect. So for her inward work to be effective, She must call in all her powers and gather them together from the diversity of things to a single inward activity. St. Augustine says the soul is rather where she loves than where she gives life to the body. For example, there was once a pagan master who was devoted to an art, that of mathematics, to which he had devoted all his powers. He was sitting by the embers making calculations and practicing this art, when a man came along who drew a sword and, not knowing that it was his master, said, "Quick, tell me your name or I'll kill you." The master was too absorbed to see or hear the foe, or to catch what he said. He was unable to utter a word, even to say, "My name is so-and-so." And so the enemy, having cried out several times, got no answer, cut off his head. And this was to acquire a mere natural science. How much more, then, should we withdraw from all things in order to concentrate all our powers on perceiving and knowing the one infinite, uncreated, eternal truth? To this end, then, assemble all your powers, all your senses, your entire mind and memory. Direct them into the ground where your treasure lies buried. But if this is to happen, realize that you must drop all other works. You must come to an unknowing if you would find it. The question arises, would it not be more valuable for each power to keep to its own task, none hindering the others in their work, nor God in his? Might there not be in me a manner of creaturely knowing that is not a hindrance, just as God knows all things without hindrance, and so too the blessed in heaven? That is a good question. Note the explanation. The blessed see God in a single image, and in that image they discern all things. God too sees himself thus, perceiving all things in himself. He need not turn from one thing to another as we do. Suppose in this life we always had a mirror before us, in which we saw all things at a glance, and recognized them in a single image. Then neither action nor knowledge would be any hindrance to us. But we have to turn from one thing to another, and so we can only attend to one thing at the expense of another. For the soul is so firmly attached to the powers that she has to flow with them wherever they flow, because in every task they perform, the soul must be present and attentive, or they could not work at all. If she is dissipated by attending to outward acts, this is bound to weaken her inward work. For at this birth, God needs and must have a vacant, free, and unencumbered soul, containing nothing but himself alone, which looks to nothing and nobody but him. As to this, Christ says, "Whoever loves anything but me, whoever loves father and mother or many other things, is not worthy of me. I did not come upon earth to bring peace, but a sword, to cut away all things, to part you from sister, brother, mother, child, and friend, that in truth are your foes." Matthew 10:34-36. For whatever is familiar to you is your foe. If your eye wanted to see all things, and your ear to hear all things, and your heart to remember all things, then indeed your soul would be dissipated in all these things. Accordingly, a master says, to achieve an interior act, a man must collect all his powers as if into a corner of his soul, where, hiding away from all images and forms, he can get to work. Here he must come to a forgetting and an unknowing. There must be a stillness and a silence for this word to make itself heard. We cannot serve this word better than in stillness and in silence. There we can hear it, and there too we will understand it aright, in the unknowing. To him who knows nothing, it appears and reveals itself. Another question arises. You might say, "Sir, you place all our salvation in ignorance." That sounds like a lack. God made man to know, as the prophet says, "Lord, make them know." T-O-B. Is that
Tobit. Yeah, that's
Tobit? Tobit 13:4.
Yeah.
Where there is ignorance, there is a lack. Something is missing. A man, brutish, an ape, a fool, and remains so long as he is ignorant. But here we must come to a transformed knowledge, and this unknowing must not come from ignorance, but rather from knowing. We must get to this unknowing. Then we shall become knowing with divine knowing, and our unknowing will be ennobled and adorned with supernatural knowing. And through holding ourselves passive in this, we are more perfect than if we were active. That is why one master declares that the sense of hearing is nobler than that of sight. For we learn more wisdom by hearing than by seeing, and in it live more wisely. We hear of a pagan master who lay dying. His disciples discussed in his presence some noble art, and dying though he was, he lifted up his head to listen, saying, "Oh, let me learn this art now, that I may rejoice in it forever." Hearing draws in more, but seeing rather leads outward. The very act of seeing does this. Therefore, in eternal life, we shall rejoice far more in our power of hearing than in that of sight. For the act of hearing, the eternal word, is within me, but the act of seeing goes forth from me. In hearing, I am passive, but in seeing, I am active. But our bliss lies not in our activity, but in being passive to God. For just as God is more excellent than creatures, by so much is God's work more excellent than mine. It was from his immeasurable love that God set our happiness in suffering, for we undergo more than we act and receive incomparably more than we give. And each gift that we receive prepares us to receive yet another gift, indeed a greater one. And every divine gift further increases our receptivity and the desire to receive something yet higher and greater. Therefore, some teachers say that it is in this respect the soul is commensurate with God. For just as God is boundless in giving, so too the soul is boundless in receiving or conceiving. And just as God is omnipotent to act, so too the soul is no less profound to suffer. And thus she is transformed with God and in God. God must act, and the soul must suffer. He must know and love himself in her. She must know with his knowledge and love with his love. And thus she is far more with what is his than with her own, and so too her bliss is more dependent on his action than on her own. The pupils of Saint Dionysius asked him why Timothy surpassed them all in perfection. Dionysius replied, "Timothy is a God-suffering man. Whoever is expert at this could outstrip all men. In this way, your unknowing is not a lack, but your chief perfection, and your suffering your highest activity. And so in this way, you must cast aside all your deeds and silence your faculties if you really wish to experience this birth in you. If you would find the newborn king, you must outstrip and abandon all else that you might find, that we may outstrip and cast behind us all things unpleasing to the newborn king. May he help us, who became a human child, in order that we might become the children of God. Amen."
Amen.
Wow.
All right. Well, that's fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you for reading that.
Yeah, no problem. So,
There's a lot there to unpack.
there's so much in there. Like, as I was reading it, I was like, how do you try to unravel this? Like, it's so intertwined. Everything is so intertwined,
Mm-hmm.
right?
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah, I think that like what's very fascinating is I'm reading Eckhart in conjunction with a lot of the Zen readings that I'm doing, and that I'm in the middle of, and reading that in conjunction with scripture. And what I'm finding is like there's this through line that there's this deeper, there's a level of like the words and what they're saying, and at some level they're just signposts to get you to a deeper place.
Yeah.
It's that deeper place where like what Eckhart is talking about here is the birth of Christ in the soul,
Right.
right, where the King of the Jews is born, right? But what he's talking about is like it's the words are almost scaffolding to a temple that's being built, that's housing the real presence, right? And I
Mhm.
see with like where he's getting here is like he could only have written this from a place of profound contemplation to
Oh
be
gosh,
able
yeah.
to get to this place where because he's using metaphors that like I can imagine that if you're not used to either mystical experience or mystical writings, either way, it can sound like gibberish, right? Like, what is this guy
Yeah.
talking about? But then you realize, like, when you're really holding on to what he's saying, what he's describing is something that at its core, this man has profoundly experienced.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I totally get that from it. There's no way he could describe any of that,
Yeah.
um, without having had the experience, and here's the thing that I find most interesting about that is that our experiences are almost ineffable, right?
Hmm. They truly are.
Yeah, like, th we talk about embody in this little corner all the time,
Right.
and, but to encapsulate what you are embodying, like, or what's happening to you in your personal life, in your actual life experiences,
Hmm.
it's almost impossible to articulate, which makes it really, like, in my mind, it makes it really godlike,
Yeah.
like characteristic of God, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, that was just a thought.
So, Ron, to your question, I've got a few things I'm kind of chewing on right now. I've been slowly trying to work my way through some of the Lotus Sutras, just because I haven't really read any of the Buddhist scriptures. But the secondary stuff that I'm reading is Shunryo Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and then I'm also reading Thomas
Mhm.
Merton's comparison between Zen Buddhism and Christianity called Zen and the Birds of Appetite. And so there's a few different titles that I'm kind of slowly chewing my way through. So just to answer your question there, but yeah. Um, the the direction I wanted to go with this, just because it was really interesting that Sherry and I, when we get together, our conversations are basically everything is up for grabs. We're going to talk about just
Yeah,
about anything under the sun. Um, and it was interesting because I had sent it over. I've been reading also through Nicholas of Cusa's books, that his book, The Vision of God, which is amazing. It's an amazing book. And one of the things that Cusa excels at is these very simple but very explosive metaphors. Um, and so I, as I've been reading through those, I was like, hey, we need to talk. Sherry's getting back from vacation. I haven't been on Grail Country for a while, so let's have a conversation. And
I love it.
um, it was so funny because you had recommended, or we had kind of landed on this second sermon as kind of just an anchor for the conversation. After the day after, I had just been out. My fiance is in the middle of moving down to San Diego, and so we're in between places, and so we're trying to get everything, get the move settled. Um, and we were staying out at a campground
Mhm.
just here in San Diego that's just tucked away in kind of a residential neighborhood, but like just a nice big rural property with like this beautiful pond. And it's been, hotter than blazes out here on the West Coast, pretty
Right.
much everywhere.
Yeah, same here. Yeah.
But so we get out there in the evening, and it's like one of my favorite times of the year is that those summer evenings are just magical. The air is warm, but it's no longer blazing hot.
Yeah.
And and uh and it was Monday. I had a terrible day at work. I was grumpy. I just was not. We all get there. We have our days where it's just like,
Mhm.
you know what, this day is just not. I'm not a big fan, you know,
I don't like
and
Mondays.
and I got so I pull up into the campsite, and we've got some tropical moisture moving here into Southern California because there's a bunch of there's a bunch of tropical storms kind of down south in Mexico that are coming up this direction. And so the sky is beautiful. Like you got all these big, beautiful thunder clouds and all this, tropical moisture in the air as the sun is setting. And I looked up and I took a deep breath and I looked up at these trees and the hills that were around us. And I just was like, I took a deep breath. It was a long day and I had to kind of reset so I could be attentive, for my
Mhm.
fiance, because she doesn't need to bear the brunt of my work
Yeah.
frustrations.
Oh, you're
Right.
grumpy?
And so I took a deep breath and I looked up to the hills and I saw the beauty around me. And I was like, oh, there it is.
There it is. Yeah.
Right. And I just took a deep breath and just was like, okay, I'm here.
Yeah.
Right. Which is a struggle for me. And we'll talk about like meditation all the time, but like my day-to-day life, my moment by moment life is a struggle to be, I'm always in the future or I'm dealing with something in the past, and being right here is always I don't know. Can you hear me, Sherry?
Yeah. It's a little
Okay.
bit
There we go.
roboty. Yeah.
Am I back?
Yeah. Is that on your end, or I don't think it's my end?
It's just, there's a bunch of weird, crazy internet interruptions out here. I don't know what's going on with that, but
Yeah. Okay.
so anyway, so we go out on a walk. There's this beautiful pond right in the middle of the property. And it's just that perfect. It's the golden hour. Right.
Mhm. Oh,
And
yeah.
we're
That's
just
true.
walking around the pond. We're not even talking. We're just kind of soaking it in. It's gorgeous. The sky's beautiful. Everything is just happening all at once. Right. And I remember I just looked out over the water and I was watching how the setting sun and these big, beautiful eucalyptus trees were mostly what it was around the pond, but there's also some fruit trees, all this kind of stuff. Really beautiful, like just a beautiful evening. And I was looking into the pond and I was watching everything reflected
Oh, yeah.
perfectly in the stillness of, it was just one of those perfectly still evenings, no wind. It was just perfect. And I was like, this is the icon of consciousness and awareness, is that it's, the water is aware of what's going on in the world around it in what it reflects. And the world is aware of its self in what is being reflected back to it by the water. It's like there's
Right,
this
right.
awareness. And it came into this profound sense of, like, I mean, it was God's presence, but I'm not going to describe it in that way right off the bat, because I
Right.
want to be able to describe the sense of what it was, is that I was aware of my surroundings and my surroundings were aware of me. And I was watching all of these things happen. And there was this shared field of awareness.
Mm.
And this shared field of awareness it was very simple. It wasn't like fireworks going off. It was I am.
Right.
I
Yeah.
am. And it was
Yeah.
just in the stillness. I was just like, I was hearing that over and over again. I'd see, what I was seeing was that, like, um, in all these interdependent systems that go all the way down, like, is the pond possible without the soil substrate that's
Yeah,
underneath?
yeah.
And is the soil possible without the earth structure and crust core? I mean, you can go all the way down to the quarks and subatomic particles if you want. This is all in that field of how the Buddhists would describe, like, the dependent arising that comes out of the nothingness. And I
Right.
felt that same sense that I was coming out of the nothingness into this field of awareness that was also always omnipresent and omni-aware.
Right.
Right. And I remember, like, just the feeling of being able to, and I grappled with the experience afterwards. Because I'm like, wow, I can experience this awareness. I can stay in this place of awareness for a little while, but I know what's going to happen. I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to wake up in the morning. I'm going to go to work, and I'm going to be back in my day. And kind of like what Eckhart is
Yeah,
describing
I was
here.
just thinking, like, he's talking about how the senses just dissipate us outward, right?
Right. You're going to get scattered throughout the day. That's
Into
the
all
name
our
of the game.
parts.
Right. And so, like, and it dawned on me. I'm like, oh, this state of awareness is, like, every once in a while you're able to stumble into it, and it's It's glorious. It's radiant. It filled my soul because I was just grumpy, you know. But it so that awareness is always there, but we have to practice that. And I
Mhm.
think it's like, and the reason why I was receptive to it is I was quiet. I didn't
Yeah,
have
like
anything to
yeah,
say, and honestly, I didn't have much I was thinking about. I just had
yeah,
my eyes open,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And and I think like in those kind of those Zen-like moments, what I realize is the one thing that I feel like is profoundly unique, as I've continuing to study and work through the Dharmic traditions. One thing that's profoundly unique about Christianity, and that is profoundly unique about how this shared sense. I mean, I can read a Buddhist and be like, oh yeah, I'm with you. You know what I mean? Or I can read it. I can read these Dharmic traditions and be like, yes, there's profound truth here.
Mhm.
But what tends to happen is there is a sense where the the person is ephemeral and dissolves, right? And so the person
Yeah.
dissolves away, is absorbed into the Godhead, or is absorbed into nirvana
You know
in
what I
some
would
way.
call that, Jed? I
What's
call
that?
that you know what I would call that?
What's that?
It gives me a feeling of loneliness.
Right.
There's no relationship there, right? It's
Right.
just it's either all you and the great oneness, or it's just the great oneness and no you. You know?
Right.
There's just no well, it's love, really. There's no love between the things, right? The oneness and the particular.
Yeah, it can veer in that direction. But what was interesting is like what makes it unique is that so Christianity speaks of resurrection, and the person is an everlasting quantity, or is an everlasting entity, right? The person
Yeah,
is an enduring reality, and resurrection kind of entails that, right? Is that there's not like some far distant epoch in the future where we cease to be, in a sense, the characters that we are, right?
right,
We don't lose the persona, um, it, and it's the ability to experience and grow and to be receptive into those depths that God has for us. Like, if God is infinitely giving and we're infinitely receiving, what it is this it's this invitation into the realm of basically infinite experience, right? Which is what suffering is. Suffering is just simply experience. It's the same word in Greek, passion, just to undergo, to suffer, to go
right.
through. Um, and so to me, like what was really fascinating with all of this is like, it's not in those moments of awareness, there's also an awareness that I've existed in God in some way forever, right? And that this birth that Eckhart is talking about, where is the King of the Jews born? Where is Christ born? Here and now, right? In me. And that doesn't I don't always live in that conscious awareness, because the scattered powers of the soul throughout the day, you have to come back to this place. It's like coming back to
Yeah.
the temple, you know.
Well, one of the things that stood out to me about that, and I love it. I mean, it's every time I'm reading Meister Eckhart, I'm thinking, George MacDonald definitely read him.
Mhm.
But I love the emphasis he places on the birth of the child, right, in the ground of the soul,
Mhm.
because it's only through wonder that you can enter into this kind of reciprocal knowing with
Mhm.
creation and with God, right? Like, you
Right.
just don't it doesn't happen if you don't have that childlike wonder,
Right.
right? Because then your brain is too busy analyzing everything to actually hear the conversation that's happening all around you, you know?
Mhm.
And that was another thing while I was reading the thing, I was like, "Yeah, this is so right about the hearing being the superior way of taking in, um, how did he put that? Like, just as a sense, right? For because the eyes move you into action, whereas the ears move you into some kind of contemplation, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Like an inward space where you can imagine. Because you have to imagine. If you don't imagine, this is the arena
Mm-hmm.
for this for what he's describing, right? And now
Right.
here's the other thing that was going through my mind. I'm doing this series with Jeremy called Lives of the Saints.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit of it. It's excellent, by the way.
Oh, good. And one of the motivating things for me about it was, or to do it, one of the reasons I wanted to do it was because I wanted to understand what it was that the ascetics are doing. The saints, many of them were monks, some of them were
Mm-hmm.
hermits. You know, like there's just a never-ending list. We can do this series forever, which is super exciting to me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, there's I had a long while ago, I had a conversation with Paul Kingsnorth about how to basically the question boiled down to what does it mean to be in the world but not of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so to me, the only answer to that question is asceticism. But the asceticism is so wrongly perceived. Like I can't imagine I'm sure there were a few wayward monks who were just doing it wrong, right? They were maybe beating themselves up and trying,
Mm-hmm.
their eyes took them into an activity, right? Took them out, dissipated them out through the eyes into an action that was just based on wrong perception, actual wrong perception.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're listening to the voice of God and you go out into the wilderness, and then you're going to do all those things that Meister Eckhart's talking about. You're going to gather in, right? In order to be able to allow that newborn child to be born in the ground of the soul. And so anyway, that's just something that I felt really burdened to understand better.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, Meister Eckhart's not easy to parse, but he is making a good case for asceticism. Let me put it that way,
Well, and
right?
I think and I think there's like I have like this profoundly monastic aspect to my personality and like my desire complex, right? Like
Yeah.
there's an aspect of me, not entirely, because there's the other part of me that you know, loves to live wild and free. But that ascetic aspect, um, I find that sometimes the more rigorous I am in asceticism, the less I experience that life. And then there's sometimes it's like there's this balance point between getting out there and experiencing the world, right? Maybe it's just and in some senses where it's most balanced is where it doesn't feel like asceticism at all. It just feels like the practice that puts you there, right? And
Mm.
so like remembering what I feel like being not of this world is an act of memory, right? And so this is what tying back to what I was talking about earlier is that sense of like in some way, you could say like if you wanted to be very pious and not get into heretical grounds, just say I've always existed in the mind of God, right? I think there's more than that, by the way, but I'll reserve those my controversial opinions on that.
Don't throw
Say
us in
that,
the deep end too quickly.
yeah, oh goodness, yeah. Is it like I've always there's something there in the encounter with God, and it's not something. I mean, we can talk about this. The only way that anybody will have the only way you can have any understanding of it actually is to experience it, right?
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Is
Well, this is what I'm
It's
saying.
like what
Like,
Eckhart says, like so the soul shares the same ground with God. It's the same thing. That's what I'm talking about. There is this shared ground that has always been there. and that it exists outside of time. Even you can touch on it in time, but it exists outside of time, right?
Yeah.
And so the asceticism or the practice, and that's the way I like to look at it, because I'm very anxious about pious language, because I think a lot of times piety amounts to
I'm
so much
trying to win
bullshit.
it back, though. I'm trying to free it from all its baggage.
Yeah, and
Like, that's what
I
I'm
think
trying to
it's
do.
always, it's like anything. Words have like, it's like a
It just
tool,
gets so ossified and yeah.
right? So people they get so wrapped up in the language of sounding like they're,
Mhm, mhm,
holy, accomplished, Christians, and they use the right language and say the right things. And I'm wary of that.
mhm.
But like where the real encounter happens, there's something that that fundamentally alters. Even if you only have a few of those experiences in your entire lifetime, that's okay. You become aware that, oh my gosh, there's something more to life. There's something more to God than I could perceive just by my rational thinking. And there's something more to me than I could come to an understanding of outside of that divine encounter.
Okay,
And
I wanna read a Meister Eckhart quote here,
sure.
really quick. "Spirituality is not to be learned by flight from the world, or by running away from things, or by turning solitary and going apart from the world. Rather, we must learn an inner solitude wherever or with whomsoever we may be. We must learn to penetrate things and find God there."
Say that
So,
again. Read that one more time.
spirituality is not to be learned by flight from the world, or by running away from things, or by turning solitary and going apart from the world. Rather, we must learn an inner solitude wherever or with whomsoever we may be. We must learn to penetrate things and find God there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like for me, when I imagined, like you talked about it in terms of a temple being built, right?
Right.
And I imagine an inner monastery,
Okay.
right? With a divine liturgy that never ends, kind of thing,
Mm-hmm. There we go.
right?
Yes.
And so every that's the window you're looking out of. That's the music that's playing in your head. Those are the smells that you can smell. You can smell the candles, you can smell the incense, you can hear the choir, and you look at the world from that window, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that would be, and like of course it's not like 24/7, but that would be a good way for me to describe the way that I move out.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even if I'm in a traffic jam on my way to the grocery store, I'm
Mm-hmm.
just like, "What are you doing, God?" Right? "What's happening?" Because the liturgy's playing. I'm in it, right? I'm part of it. And so nothing has no rhyme or reason. I might not know why I'm in a traffic jam. I might not know why I didn't make that green light. I might not know why I did make the green light.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, every now and then we get this little moment where someone says, "Oh, if you would have been there just a few minutes earlier or a few minutes later, you would have been killed."
Mm-hmm.
Or you would have seen someone killed, or you would have found that thing, or you know what I mean? Like there's all these, this is Jung's synchronicities, the
Mm-hmm.
things, the beautiful synchronicities, right? That we get to look into. But for me, those are, I don't need like I don't need synchronicities in order for me to believe that I'm part of a divine liturgy that's happening all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need the synchronicities anymore. I did. There was a time where I needed that as a confirmation or,
Right. Right.
you know? So anyway, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. It's interesting I mean, it's nice when those synchronicities come. And I think we all experience
No,
them.
yeah,
The
yeah,
good
yeah.
vibes, feels, whatever or the things where,
Especially if it happens between people. Like, if it's
right,
happening between 2 people, then it's like everyone gets to blow their mind for, like, 3 seconds, you know?
right. But it's that way with like kind of any experience, because the way that we experience being is we experience being in time. That's the very
Mhm.
Heideggerian kind of way. But I like Bergson better than Heidegger. I think he's much better on the experience of time. Is like there's this ceaseless flow that Bergson calls durée, from like French duration, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Durée,
yeah.
right? So there's not, time is not like a static property, but it's just flow, and it's continuous. And so
It's like the Tao, right? The river.
the Tao would be a fantastic way to look at, in a sense, could approximate some very Bergsonian ideas. But we have this experience of time where it's this ceaseless flow. Now, when we're in it, we're toggling back and forth between past and present and future, and we're looking back at what's behind us. We're looking ahead to what's in front of us, and we're in that present moment is just moving along almost like a zipper. It's
Mhm.
just kind of
Mhm.
moving through time. And so the way we experience that being, like, we can't. I mean, maybe there's some mystics that want to go up and sit on the mountaintop and just remain in that still place forever, right? But the reality is that when we're looking for stillness, there's no stillness in the cosmos. Everything is moving all at once. There's no still place anywhere. Like, just strictly scientifically speaking, there is no stillness. At least down to anything that we can observe. It's always moving all the time. So it's like, how do we find that still place in this ceaseless flow of experience? And you realize, like, that still place is, in Eckhart's terms, it's the Grund. It's the it's the it's the shared space that the soul and God have together, that is always omnipresent, omni-available, open to us entering into that place. And that's where
Mhm.
the stillness happens.
Yeah,
And
and again, I'm just gonna reiterate, it's I would describe that as wonder. Like, when
yeah,
you are actually in wonder, you are in relationship to God, and yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
so, like, that's the thing about wonder, childlike wonder, is that there's a sense of companionship there, right?
Hmm.
That you're
Well, and that,
actually not alone. You're with
yeah,
somebody, and you're enjoying this with somebody, with God,
right,
to be
right.
specific. Um, and then when you wake up in the morning, suddenly you realize that all your carpeting in your bedroom has turned to moss, and there's a vine growing up your wall, and there's a door out into fairyland, right? This is how George MacDonald opens Phantastes.
Hmm.
And the world becomes enchanted.
Right, right.
You can't think of the world as enchanted. You can't imagine it to be enchanted. You can't put yourself in that place. You actually have to let that newborn king be born in the ground of your soul.
Right,
I mean, this is
right.
what parents experience briefly and like momentarily with their own children when they get to live vicariously through their eyes, right? And you
Yes.
watch a child wonder at something or be amazed at something, and you get filled up with that experience because that's how you experience enchantment
Well, and
as a child.
there's kind of these, like, what I'm noticing as we're reading through Eckhart is there's some remarkable practicalities in what he's saying, if you can kind of catch them.
Yeah, I
So
did.
when he
Yeah.
talks about unknowing, right? Well, what does that actually mean, right? What does he mean by unknowing? How do we go into this place of unknowing? Is he talking about kind of going into like a catatonic state? Is that what he's talking about? And he answers it as no. And I think it's very helpful for people who maybe are like me, where you got the mind that's always going and always moving and looking at new
Mhm.
ideas and reaching out towards some object of knowledge, right? What he's talking about unknowing is a little bit different. Um, but where he says this, and it's on page 43 of the text, it says, but here we must come to a transformed knowledge, and this unknowing must not come from ignorance, but rather from knowing we must get to unknowing.
Yeah, I
So,
know. I love that.
and I kind of, I was looking back, and, I mean, I talked here, I was have had some wonderful conversations with my fiance as we've been kind of getting her moved down here, and just, we've been apart for about 6 months. And so getting a chance to reconnect. And I, one of the things, like, I have a conflicted relationship with a lot of my evangelical, biblical and theological training. But I look back on that now,
Mhm.
20, almost 25 years later. Goodness gracious, it's been a while since I've been a student in that setting. But I'm thankful for that, because it was, well, it wasn't the thing. Knowing is always a certain kind of scaffolding to the thing. It's not the thing
Yeah,
itself.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, I've accumulated over the years of, careful study and a curious, inquisitive mind. I've accumulated a certain knowledge base that is really helpful once I
Yeah.
can let it go, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so when I, but where it's really useful, what I find is, so reading like the Desert Fathers, reading Origen or Evagrius or Maximus, or um, you know, these guys, is there, if you make it understanding the great theologians and the great fathers and the great mystics an end in itself, it's just another academic exercise.
Mhm.
What it can do is, when you enter into that place of real authentic experience, you have this wealth of vocabulary to be able to describe what you have experienced.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
and
No, that
and
totally.
it's always going to be around the edges of the experience. You can
Yeah.
never capture an experience verbally, but it's there. And I feel like that's, and like, my fiance had put a question to me, because I've always kicked around the idea of maybe going back for more formal theological training and all that kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
I was like, nah, you know what? That's not where I feel called. Like, where I feel called is, like, I feel like I'm never going to know everything. I know that, but I feel like I've learned enough of how to learn, to go out and learn the things that, I feel guided to in some sense.
Yeah.
Um, but I feel like for me, that journey is now focused first and foremost in learning to grow in the experience of God.
Yeah.
And then all that other stuff is really useful in helping to describe that experience. But where you're talking about, like, beginning in wonder, it's, that's kind of, it features predominant in my meditations, right? So, wonder is, I think, the conceptual equivalent of what the biblical language for fear is really driving at, right? There's a wavelength of fear that is just terror. You're terrified. But there's a wavelength of fear that is very healthy and life-giving, and it's the wonder. When you're encountering the wonder and the beauty of nature, you're astonished, because you are in this world that you yourself did not make, but that you're a part of it. And learning to look to God as the one who has created all these things, it moves the soul to a kind of fear, or a kind of wonder, that is, it's kind of like, when he's talking about, the soul's ability to conceive, is because the
Mhm.
soul, in that state of wonder, the soul is able to receive from God,
Yeah.
and then to conceive the life that God is implanting into the soul.
Right. And I keep thinking of the Theotokos, right? Because that's what she does. She conceives Christ.
Right.
And that's what Eckhart's talking about. So I'm like, okay, because the story in the gospel of Mary meeting the angel and being given the news and saying yes is a lot more accessible than what Meister Eckhart writes in this sermon, right? It's a story. It's a narrative. It involves another human being. an angelic being, a child being conceived, right? And so I can take that whole story and I can map that right onto what Meister Eckhart's talking about. Which is why I come to see very clearly, and it's also, I think, why he ends the sermon this way, that it's about a child, right? It's about being a child. And I just keep coming back to this. Like this just doesn't, maybe I'm totally biased. I don't know. But I just see it everywhere. He starts out with a child who is born, right? King of the Jews. He ends with the newborn king. George MacDonald starts out with his sermons with child in the mist,
Yeah.
and that's how the gospel begins, with a child being born.
Right.
But I wanted to read you mentioned origin, and I ran across this recently in something that I was reading. It's a quote about origin. Understand. So, okay, before I read this, I want to clarify why I want to read it, because we think of Origin as a theologian, but when I was reading Origin, I was thinking of him as a mystic. Okay? Because Origin was very freely admitting that he didn't really know what he was talking about. Most of the time. Doing lots of thought experiments, but we've got ourselves in this modern world, we've got ourselves so shoehorned into what theology is that we think that if you're a theologian, you must know and believe what you're talking about. Well, Origin was like the first man on the moon when it came to theology. He was trying to make sense of all these disparate parts, because that's what the Bible was. It was just a bunch of books laying around, and he was trying to bring them into some kind of coherent thing. And I think that the reason he was trying to do that was because he had a vision from his own experience, right? But Nate did a thing. I started watching it about theology and poetry. And I was watching the conversation. I was like, "Ooh, I wish I would have been there." Because here's the thing. There is no theology without poetry.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
And you could also say there is no theology without mysticism, because that's what poetry is. Poetry is a conversation with being itself. Okay?
Right.
And so anyway, let me read this.
Sure.
Origin thing.
Fantastic.
Understand that you have within yourself herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and flocks of goats. And the birds of the air are also within you. Do not be surprised if we say that these are within you, but understand that you are another little world. There's the theologian Origin. I just had to throw that in there. Now, where would he get that? He must have experienced it. He must have experienced a flock of goats inside of him, or a flock of sheep, or birds of the air, right? So anyway, and then this gets back to what I was talking about right in the beginning, Jed, of how ineffable our experiences actually are. Right. But anyway. Yeah.
Well, and that world within us, you become, when you step in and you're, which is interesting, because I mean, one of the cool things, I love studying cosmology, right? What happened, what happened at the Big Bang? What happened before it? What happened after it? How big is the cosmos? Because you're dealing with scale that is almost so unthinkable that you gain a sense of how truly immense the world is outside. But then science also teaches us, you take things all the way down to like the Planck scale, which is the smallest measurement, unit of measure for both time and for space, right? Planck time,
Right.
Planck space, the Planck constant. We're more massive compared to like one unit of the Planck constant than the universe is massive with respect to us. It's a very small unit of measure, right? I mean, it's
Mhm.
like we're cosmically large compared to the smallest unit of measure, and we stand actually somewhere on the cosmic scale, somewhere around the midpoint in terms of just size and scope,
Yeah.
right? And that vastness, it gives you a sense of just it inculcates in the soul a sense of humility, a posture, an openness, right?
Yeah.
Of the great, I love what you're saying when like, Origin freely admits he doesn't know what he's talking about, which means he does know what he's talking about,
Yeah. 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 He's
right?
he's actually inhabiting that unknowing space.
Because as much as he knows, and if you think of knowledge, if you were trying to quantify knowledge, which I think would be a
Mhm.
foolish thing to really try to do, but for a thought experiment, let's use that thought experiment, is if you were to try to quantify knowledge with respect to anything that you can know about anything, you know next to nothing compared to how much can be known about that.
Right.
Even if you
Yeah.
spend 10,000 lifetimes learning a thing, you have still
Yeah.
only just begun. And so the idea of, like, even as we're talking about it, I think this helps tease out that sense of unknowing is your 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 lack of knowledge
Mhm.
is always going to exceed what you quantitatively know, right?
Yeah.
And so once you think you know something, you've got to be careful because, it's like, oh, I know that now. It's like, well, no, you know about that now, but you don't necessarily know that now.
Yeah.
And so um I when I think of that side of things, is that becomes like the knowledge is just all it is descriptive language ultimately for the experience of God. And when it
Yeah.
becomes just about the language, you've evacuated theological language of all meaning when it's divorced from the actual encounter. And and so I think, as we in our conversations, and hopefully for people that are listening, is, there's a lot of ways to enter into that space: meditation, going out for a walk in nature, prayer, reading the scriptures. There's all kinds of practices and spiritual disciplines and ascetic practices that can help you get to that space. And I'm not advocating one versus another here.
No.
Um, but as we have these conversations, one of the desires in my heart is to learn how to communicate it in such a way that maybe helps somebody realize just how hungry they are for those experiences as well, and to where
Yeah.
you can really truly be touched by the living reality of God, and that the awareness, the immensity of what that actually represents. um, and it's like, with the understanding is, even as we talk about these experiences, I love how T.S. Eliot puts it, is like, it's a raid on the inarticulate, and every word is a kind of failure, right? Because our words are only, they're like verisimilitude. It's like, gets us as close to the truth as we can get, but it's not the same thing as the truth, right?
Right. It
Uh,
becomes the truth when it's embodied by the Spirit of God. George MacDonald talks about this in regards to words, right? Because he believes that all of creation comes from God's imagination and that it is every representation, all the forms, every living thing out there, even rocks, are imbued with a meaning that God gave them, which is, of course, like, how does he put that? When God says something, he says, um, how does he put that now? He says just what he knows, or when we say something, we say more than we know we're saying, right? When God says it, he says it. But the thing is that when God says it, it's like fathoms deep. So then when we take from the creation and we recombine, and use that as our words, like Eliot in the Four Quartets, we're saying all
Mhm.
kinds of things that we don't know that we're saying, right?
Yeah. Right.
Um, now I forgot what I was actually trying to get to. Um, oh, incarnation. Oh, yeah. So George MacDonald says, taking from God's imagination directly from Sophia,
Mhm.
right? Wisdom is speaking words of the spirit and not of the flesh.
Right.
Think about that. Like I remember thinking, oh my, okay, that's a whole new meaning. Thank you, George. He like opened a little door there for me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm just going to read you a quote from Saint Anastasius of Antioch, which was in Max Leif's Substack recently, and this has to
Okay.
do with knowing and unknowing.
Oh yeah.
When you were
Max has so
talking,
much good stuff on his Substack.
oh man,
Max Leaf,
so
guys, is let me just put the name up here so you can see it.
yeah,
Look him up.
he's
It's
amazing,
great.
amazing. And one of these days, I'm going to have a conversation with him. I hope. Just want to, but he's just like really smart.
Yeah, check his Substack out. It's superb.
So here's the quote: "We should not think that the cloud is some vaporous exhalation from the earth, or an evaporation of water, or some condensation from the air, or anything airy at all, which is produced from bodily substance. Rather, we should think of it as knowledge of the divine nature, made
Mhm.
accessible to us and reaching down to us, which is more appropriate to call, as David does, God's splendor." And then in Max's words, he says, "People are liable to regard a statement like this with no small amount of incredulity, but we should consider that we might not always know better. Philosophers since Plato's day have observed that it's impossible to learn something we believe we already know." So I think that this points directly at Meister Eckhart's Unknowing, where you have to just say, I haven't got a clue,
Yeah.
right? Maybe
Yeah.
there are dragons in the clouds. The kids see them all the time. Maybe they are really there, right? And then what happens to your world when you say that? Everything changes, in my opinion.
It does. It does. And it's in these what I notice is like I thought at some point, I think that I've grown, hopefully growing out of this sense, um, is that if I could just have the right experience, I would be transformed,
Mm.
right? And I've had lots of experiences, um, and the transformation comes always much slower than I would like. Um, but
That's
what I've
because we're
learned
used to
is that
walking through we're used to buying entrance into the amusement park. Let's put
right,
it like that.
right,
We think that if we cross a threshold that we're there. Meanwhile, our whole life is the frickin' threshold.
yeah.
Like,
Well, and
believe me.
it's set out in front of us in a way, it's like, and this may be like it may sound like a Calvinist here in some senses, but like I
Mhm,
think God providentially orders our lives in such a way so that what we are encountering in our lives is facilitating our deeper union with Him, right?
mhm.
Or it can, if you're aware, if you have enough awareness. And it's not like you can be cognizant. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like being, intellectually
Oh, no,
engaged
no,
is not what I'm talking about here.
no. It's not
Like
like, "Oh, I gotta pay attention, I gotta pay
I've got
attention."
an
Mhm.
idea. That's not it. Like it's not the
No.
idea that I have. Like that's the epiphany that's going to change it all.
Yeah.
Is the experience is just in some senses it's the remembering.
Mhm.
It's the remembering. It's the experience of, in some senses, the apokatastasis, the restoration, the going back to the original
Well,
state.
it's a reconciliation of all things too. Like I really love that word because if it's all things, then it's the things that don't belong together, right?
Yeah.
And how do you reconcile those? And then you get caught up in this moment of like really paradoxical notions.
Right.
And then you're at the burning bush because the burning bush is a paradox, right?
Right.
It's like the epitome of paradox.
Right. And well, and I don't know if anybody's had the distinct pleasure of working in a kitchen before or in restaurants and those kinds of things.
Mhm.
I was never really a back of the house guy. I was always, a waiter or a bartender, busboy, all the front of the house stuff. But you could go, the magic was in the restaurant, was not what was happening with the customers and everything out there. The magic is in the kitchen. It's so cool.
Mhm, mhm.
And I'm going to connect this to a conversation that Nate and I had with Chris Green maybe last year sometime on Bulgakov. And Chris kept saying, like, he kept saying this thing of like what's been on his mind lately is this idea of confecting or mixing or the blending of these opposites, right? And it
Mhm.
made me think of like in a kitchen when a great chef or not even just a great chef, but a great kitchen staff makes a great emulsion, right? Where you've got constituent parts that don't fit together. Oil and water would be,
Right.
you can emulsify oil and water by blending them at high speed and maybe adding some heat. And what happens is that the oil doesn't cease to be oil and the water doesn't cease to be water. They just break into these billions of little droplets that come together or are just adjacent to each other um,
Chicken.
enough to be one thing, but still retain their distinctiveness, right? The oil doesn't cease to
Mhm.
be oil, the water doesn't cease to be water. But then what happens is they get blended in a way that allows both their space, but it's one thing. It's like
Mhm.
two becoming one while still being two.
You know,
And
I made oh,
and so it just when I think of like that blending of properties, I think that there's this, that's right down into like Chalcedonian Christology, as far as like, Jesus being, fully God, fully human, um,
yes.
and
So
you know,
important.
unmixed, undivided, without separation,
Amen.
and
Yep.
all these kinds of things. Like this is really actually like, Chalcedon. What's profound about it was I think one of the most profound spiritual discoveries in human history is that you can have two things that are disparate, that are unlike, be brought together in this in this uh, in this powerful unity.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the what I find to be a little bit of the trap within spirituality, just in general, right, is that I'm going to get into this state of awareness, one way or the other, that's then that is somehow discontinuous with my normal experience, but it's actually part of it, right? So getting scattered and dispersed is a part of our daily activities. Like you have to wake up and figure out, how am I going to make the coffee, make the eggs, get out the door, get dressed. Usually you want to get dressed before you get out the door. It's a good sequentially just a good thing to keep in mind, but you're thinking in like all these different
Especially make sure
directions.
you put your pants on.
The days that I forget are definitely more interesting than the days that I don't. But yeah, so it's like we get scattered, but that's part of the point, is so that when you come back to that place of
Yes.
awareness, you see how it comes back together. And it's these like, and so
Yeah.
that those times of contemplation, or when I'm talking about that experience of reconciliation or apokatastasis, where everything is restored to its original state, is its
Mhm.
going out is as much a part of its restoration as the going out is, right? Or
But
the
yeah,
restoration is.
like we think about I just wanna clear up any false notions here because we think about the original state as Eden. But okay, well, that's the story. That's the story, the narrative or something like that. But there's some things going on in Eden that aren't, like Adam's alone. He hasn't named the animals yet. There's a serpent in the garden, like there's just some stuff. It's like, ooh, tricky. It's not perfect, right?
Right.
And it's like, to me, the original state is like Joy said here. Where did she put that here? The beauty and decadence of mayonnaise.
Speaking of emojis, there we go.
Yeah, because like if you think about Moses seeing the burning bush, he sees a light. He climbs up the mountain. He gets closer and closer and closer, and he realizes there's a bush on fire, but it isn't being consumed. So, what is his response to that? He takes his shoes off. It's almost like a standing ovation, if you will, right? He's just like, because there's something going on with the bush and the fire that he never could conceive of. They are in a relationship with each other, and they are being who they are without destroying the other. You know what I'm saying? Like I was when you were talking about that, I was thinking I make a lot of salves and creams and medicinal creams and stuff. And I'll have this oil base, right? And when I'm thickening it, I add water. But I slowly add water, and I've got my, what do you call those things? Those pulse stick things.
Little pulse blenders. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just adding a little bit of water, and the opposite thing happens. Like usually if you're cooking something or whatever, you add water, it gets diluted. It gets thinner. But when you're making stuff with oil and you add water, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So that by the time I've added all my water, my little blender can hardly manage. It's just like, getting hot and all that.
Yeah.
And I realized at that point, and this might sound really, stupid, but that the oil and the water have a relationship with each other that I know nothing about. I'm in awe. Okay? Every time I do it, I'm in awe. I'm just like, this is amazing. This is not what's supposed to happen, right? And that I just imagine that's how Moses felt when he was standing in front of that bush.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like it's that there's I could imagine, how uncanny the experience is, like when you encounter two things that shouldn't be.
But but here's the thing, they're in a secret relationship with each other. This is what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah.
Right? They know something that you don't know.
Right. Right. They're in on the secret. Like it's
they are in on it.
Right. Well, and this is I've been like going back and forth in some reading and watching some YouTube lectures. There's always this interesting interplay between David Bentley Hart and Jordan Daniel Wood, because there's some disagreement between the two of them, even though broadly speaking they're in the same camp.
Don't
because
he hates hearing things like that. Just kidding.
It's okay. Yeah. David doesn't consult me on his opinions.
I'm just kidding.
Nor should he, but
right.
But it doesn't reserve my ability to say I think they're talking about two similar things from a very different angle, right?
Right. Yeah.
But for Hart, like one of the things that he talks about in when he speaks of the incarnation in the book You Are Gods, is he talks about how God cannot become something that he isn't already inherently. Right? So in humanity is already in that sense enfolded within the oneness of God, because for Hart, everything reduces ultimately to a pretty, it's basically, his metaphysic is pretty similar to Advaita Vedanta, like a true monism, right? And the idea that like maybe fire and a a branch shares the same being, or shares the same ontological reality that undergirds both of them, that allows them to coexist in a way that brings no destruction to the bush, and but doesn't stop the fire from being what it is.
Yeah.
And so the idea that like they're in this relationship, I like that, because what it's saying is there is still a deeper unity between the
Exactly.
fire and the bush.
And then what happens in that story, Jed? God, this is just like thoughts, but it's where God says, "I am that I am," or right, and that is that's what the bush is. The bush and the fire are. They are what they are. It's
Yeah.
happening in an image right there in front of him.
Yeah. And in like it's such a remarkable way.
Yeah.
I mean, that sense of, I mean, the divine name in that passage. I mean, this is like where it, it's almost, you do have to be careful, and you've got to take off your sandals when you're approaching, a revelation of that magnitude.
Mhm.
Um, when God tells us, "This is who I am," I am, and realizing, like, when you, to touch back into the realm of experience, when we experience that, we do experience the unity that undergirds everything, that transcends everything, that interpenetrates everything, is
Mhm.
the whole realm of nature. It's like it's the garment that I am is clothed within,
Yeah.
and it's present. Like, going back to that experience that I had, it was like I became aware of God's awareness of me in the features of nature. So God was
Yeah.
aware of me as I was looking at the tree, and the tree was aware of God because it was God's creature. And there was this reciprocity. And when you were talking about like applause at some point, like clapping,
Yeah, yeah.
if you like with certain trees, not all of them, like if wind blows through the leaves of like pine trees and coniferous trees, like there's this whistling sound
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
happens. But if you get a tree with broad enough leaves, what will happen is as the wind is blowing through it, it sounds like applause.
Yeah.
Right. And I could hear the applause of creation just applauding its creator,
Right.
and the awareness that in every quanta of reality that was being presented to itself, or was being presented in this experience, was God was
Mhm.
in it.
Yeah.
And that the field of awareness that God encompasses, and that, in a sense, we could say, the consciousness being synonymous with God is one of the transcendentals, being consciousness and bliss in the Dharmic traditions, or goodness, beauty, and truth in the Western traditions. These are synonymous realities describing that one thing. Is we actually share that same awareness.
Yeah.
Like we're invited into that, and the
Well, I think that's why Origin says we have flocks of sheep within us. We have, right, I think that's the reason, Jed. I got that quote from, there's a channel on YouTube called Eternalized, and he does a once a month video. And then he also has an essay online, and he links to it. So it's all written out. It's a
Mhm.
lot of artwork. He's a Jungian psychologist.
Okay.
He's also a Christian.
Okay.
And the I just love them. Like and it's always the psychology of blah blah blah, right? The psychology of astrology, the psychology of whatever. And this month, it was the psychology of animals, and I'm like, oh, give me that,
Yeah.
right? And he talked about how the animals. I think it was a quote from a saint, but the animals, or maybe it was a psychoanalyst, had never been banished from Eden. right? Just we
Hmm.
were. And I'm like, geez, I never thought of that before because I've always had a sense that they know something that I don't know. And there's a like their relationship to the divine is just completely unhindered. It's just it's like Mary's fiat is just like it's their algorithm. You know what I mean? It's like yes. And I think Jung talks about it in terms of accepting their fate, laying down their sacrificing their lives, right? A lot of First Nations myths talk about the animals coming, caring for humanity, right? Because we're just so poorly equipped to actually look after ourselves.
Hmm.
And there's just a full acceptance of and commitment to who they actually are, which is something we lost when we got booted from the from the garden, you
That's because
know?
we forgot who we were. Like
Yeah,
Irenaeus talks about, like life is the uh, is the act of remembering. Like the east of Eden is the school of righteousness where we have to learn to remember. And some people just lose themselves and just forget entirely, and that's, I think that's always the possibility that happens, when we enter into this world, is that we can lose ourselves in it and not remember who we really are. But the point of life east of Eden is, here, I got to turn my light on because the sun is slowly setting out here.
yeah, mhm.
Um, like east of Eden, like the oppositional resistance that we face in life, the toil, the difficulty, the suffering, the experience of life itself, is what drives us to that need to remember who and what we were.
Right.
Right, because the animal knows who and what it is. Like, it reminds me, when you were saying that, it reminds me of reading in Tomberg on the Force card, right? The
Yeah,
picture of that card with the young woman with the infinite above her, and she's
and
taming this lion with effortlessly, right?
yeah,
Is she's calling out the lion that she's taming with force, but it's like kind of like the force from Star Wars or something, right?
yeah,
He
totally.
talks about it as a virginal force, right? That
Which is exactly what
virgin
Eckhart's
virgin
talking
nature,
about.
yeah, virgin nature responds, and he uses this very interesting illustration out of the book of Revelation, where around the throne of God are the four living creatures, the four
Yeah.
living beings, right? And they're animal and human in form, right?
Yeah, I know.
And so they're the epitome, they're the archetype of all living things. And then you have later in the book, you get introduced to the beasts, right? There's a few beasts out there. And it's
Yeah,
like where nature kind of oversteps her bounds. And the Leviathan crawls out of the sea that it belongs and starts making a ruckus on earth, right? And so these beasts have, in a sense, it's that forgetfulness. They've forgotten God. Like the systems that govern the world have forgotten God. They don't
yeah,
remember, so they act like a clumsy and destructive beast. But the true animality is the living creatures that surround the throne of God. And the animals, when they're just being an animal, right? The difference between a sheepdog and a rabid dog, right?
mhm,
When that sheepdog is doing its job and just being a sheepdog, it is it is it is fulfilling its purpose in creation.
right.
When it's the rabid dog attacking others, it's become beastly, right? But there is in nature, you can see it. Anytime you step outside, you can watch it happen. Is these There's an awareness, I believe, that these creatures have of God
Yeah.
simply by being what they are.
Yeah, well, the verse, "All creation groans and waits," right? Which is a metaphor of childbirth. Again.
Hmm.
Childbirth. Um, And so like creation is birthing something into the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it knows what it's doing. The child is the only one that doesn't know what's happening
Mm-hmm.
in childbirth.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
that's us. Did you ever mention to me Ursula Le Guin? Was it you that mentioned Ursula Le Guin? Somebody mentioned her to me once.
Probably wasn't me because I'm
Okay.
very not super familiar with her,
I'm
but
not sure who she is, but the
I've read a few
name,
quotes, but I've only, I've read her as she's quoted in other writers, but I
yeah.
have.
Well, in that eternalized essay, he has a quote from her. It is the animal who knows the way home.
Mm-hmm.
It is the animal within us, the primitive, the dark brother, the shadow soul, who is the guide. And that quote is taken from a book she wrote called The Child
Mm-hmm.
and the Shadow. All right.
Mm-hmm.
And the only one of Martin Shaw's books that I've ever read was Courting the Wild Twin.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read that one, Jed?
I haven't, but I've listened to a little bit of when Martin's talked about it, so
Okay. Oh, well,
familiar enough.
it's actually he reads it on Audible and it's really well read and it's short.
Oh, cool. Okay.
So, and most of the book is actually a story. I think it's called The Lindworm, which is a really interesting story about a midwife who births out the queen is pregnant, she's giving birth, and she has the first child is a serpent. And the midwife doesn't know what to do with it, so she just throws it out the window. Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
say anything. And the second, and because she's having twins, and of course, in those days they didn't have ultrasound, so they didn't know they were having twins. So the midwife just doesn't say anything about the first one, throws it out the window, and then the second one's born. It's a child, right, a little boy. And but the firstborn is the serpent, and so he comes back at some point when the prince is getting ready to get married, and he claims his birthright as the firstborn, and he
Mm-hmm.
wants this massive serpent, huge. He wants a bride, and he wants to get married first. It's a great story. I won't tell anymore, but so most of the book is kind of divided into that story and then just how Martin came to write the book. And the first part of that book is so good. It's about your wild twin, which is and I guess this, I didn't know it until I read the story, but I guess this is a theme that runs through quite a few fairy tales, right?
Yeah.
And where a twin is born, that there's another one of two girls, and the first one is hairy like a goat and has hoofs and all this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Also gets tossed out the window.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just, yeah. I just personally love that stuff because we are talking about our life experiences. And I said to Mark in our conversation, I said, I feel like that's what I've been doing for the last number of years, is
Mm-hmm.
courting the wild twin. And that wild twin is deeply Christian, you see. Like, this is the thing. Like, when I look into the eyes of my sheep, they say to me, when are you going to figure this out? That's what they're saying. How long is it going to take? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yeah, well, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about when closer to when we started. Is like I experienced that splitness in me of like the monastic and the wild man. Like, I mean,
I think all
realistically, I
monastics
haven't
are
told it.
wild men. Honestly, like, here's the thing, Jed, I'm gonna really redeem the monastic ascetic stuff because I think they are wild men.
They
I
are,
think I think they're
but
John the Baptists, right?
yeah,
Like,
well,
so yeah.
they certainly can be. But like I think in our common conception is, well, this is a holy man and this is a wild man. And I think what you're saying is fundamentally true, is that they're the same. Like in a place of spiritual health, the twins become unified in a
Yes.
sense, right?
Yes.
and I think a lot of my own spiritual journey has been trying to come to grips with the difference between the living creature that stands before the throne of God and beholds God with eyes all about, or the beast that tries to divinize itself through an act of, like a Herculean act of will,
Mhm.
right? And pretends itself towards theosis versus actually the experience of theosis. And it's like that wild man. It's not about being tame, right? The wild man, it doesn't need to be tamed.
No, the tame man needs to be wild.
Right. And like you see that, like, so when like on like all the National Geographic
Mhm.
videos out on like the Serengeti, where when the lion or the cheetah or the leopard is at its most wild is when it's in pursuit of its prey,
Mhm.
right? And you, if you watch enough of those videos, I'm taken aback by the remarkable control that these animals have. And it's not because they're thinking about it. The only thing, maybe if there's anything on their mind at all, it's just the prey that's right in front of them. And what their
Hungry.
bodies are doing
Yeah,
is just this instinctive reaction to the hunger that stimulated it, right?
yeah.
But the body, these animal bodies have remarkable control over their domain and their environment, not because they're thinking about it, but because they're just doing it.
They're participating in it. The
Right.
marriage
And
supper of the lamb.
right. And so
That's what
that's the kind of the wildness, I think, that, in my, wildest escapades I've failed to, is because I've mistaken the nature of wildness itself.
yeah,
Wildness is not about a lack of control or a lack of self-control. It's
it's
actually
actually
profoundly controlled.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, because otherwise it's chaos, right? And
Right.
nothing could survive long in that. Like, this is William Blake, "Little Lamb, who made thee?" Right? You
Mhm.
know that poem, "Little Lamb, who made thee?"
Oh, I don't
And
know.
then he's got oh, you don't know that one? And then he's got "Tiger, tiger,
Yes,
burning
Tiger,
bright."
Tiger. Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I just love those because that's how do I explain that? Like, well, first of all, it's a reconciliation of two opposites, right? The tiger and the lamb.
Mhm.
And I'm just see, I've got it here somewhere. Where did I? Oh, here. I can find it quickly. Mm, is it here? Anyway, both of them are talking about how oh, I got rid of them all. Okay, never mind. Or here. Damn it, I want to read them so badly. Um, maybe it's up here. Oh, here we go. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bid thee feed by the stream and o'er the mead. Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright. Gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee. Little lamb, I'll tell thee. He is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild. He became a little child. I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. And then he writes another poem called The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright. In the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of your eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand, and what dread feet. Where is it now? Oh, darn it. I got my PDF is all mixed up here. Anyway, that's it. But he goes into the, the violence of the tiger, and then ends it with the question, who made thee? Just as he does with the little lamb. Right? Who made thee? So in other words, God made all of it. And of course, for me, because of the speech in the book of Job that God gives to Job, he basically just lays out the complexity of the natural world. And one of the questions that he answers, or one of the things he addresses in that speech, which Jess pointed out to me, is that the friends at some point, when they're talking to Job and telling him to come down off his high horse and all that stuff and get with the program, they say, God's going to break the jaws of the lion, right? But then God says to Job in his speech, I feed the young lions. And here's the thing, Blake, his last work was the book of Job.
Yeah.
Because the book of Job is constantly challenging you with the reconciliation of opposites.
Right.
Which is apokatastasis.
Yes.
And so you have to ask yourself, what is evil? What is Leviathan? Who is the beast? Who is, and I think as a Christian, you can run over to Revelation and you can get some insight into the book of Job, or from the book of Job for Revelation, and vice versa.
Right.
About those beasts. And I also think that that's what anthroposophy did when Emil Bock talked about bridling the beasts and not eliminating them, not damning them to hell, right? Like Revelation talks about the abyss, or where they'll be thrown in for a long, long time.
Right.
Anyway, I won't say any more about that, but yeah.
Well, the proper domain of Leviathan is the sea, right? And God makes Leviathan, in a sense, it's like a plaything. It's for sport for him. It's almost like it's like an inside joke almost.
Well, in Job, he actually says, are you going to catch it with a hook? Are you going to put it on a leash and let your little girls play with it? And here's the thing. What I loved about those statements by God was he's like, you can't figure this out. You can't tame them. This is not something you'll ever understand, right? Because in order to tame something, you have to enter into its consciousness. You have to enter into its psychology. You have to understand why it is. Why does it exist? What is its being? I know this because I train horses, right? And I work with animals. And if I want to work with my horses in a humane and godly way, in my opinion, I have to understand them, who they are, and speak to them at their level, and and enter into a relationship with them. And so what God's saying about evil or chaos or Leviathan, or however you want to frame that, is you can't enter into a relationship with it. You can't join its consciousness. You can't tame it. You won't understand it. I think that's what he's saying. But what he does say about it is that it leaves a wake of silver hair, which is wisdom. Okay. And off it goes into the great beyond. Like it just swims away at the end of Job into the sea. And it's a wave of silver hair. Like he describes the foam in the ocean as silver hair. right? It's wisdom. So what do we learn from chaos? Do we ever understand it? Do we ever know what the pattern is? No, but we do grow wise from it if we allow it to teach us.
Yeah.
Because
Which
we
brings
can't
you
teach it.
back full circle, is the unknowing is the point.
There you
The
go.
lack of understanding is the understanding.
Perfect.
Yeah.
You brought that right together there. Exactly.
Well, I mean, we're at an hour and 45 minutes. So did you have anything else burning in that mind and heart of yours that we wanted to
No.
ground we haven't covered yet?
Well, I'm definitely going to give this a second read, because when I was reading it out loud, there were a lot of things going through my mind.
Yeah.
That I thought I wanted to ask you about, but then as soon as we started talking, I forgot them all. So
we can always come back to Eckhart. So
yeah.
maybe we'll mix in some Cusa there pretty soon, because it's
I'm going to grab that one, Jed,
really profound.
And depending on your schedule, I know you're a little busy at the moment, but maybe we could kind of plan for sermon 3. What do you think?
Let's do it. Yeah, I think I've got some time next week, so we could probably tune in pretty close to this same time. Is probably pretty workable for me.
Okay, okay, good. Okay, well, let's just stay in touch, and that sounds great. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And
absolutely.
Looks like we'll be back.
And then we'll take William's advice here. I think it's perfect. Not just for Jan, that's for all of us. The light is well, Shari, you've got a lot more light left in the day up there, but the light is rapidly dwindling here, and I have a need to get.
Oh, Dad, I wanted to ask you publicly: are you going to the Northwest Conference?
When is it?
12th to the 14th in Olympia, Washington.
In September?
Yeah.
No, I can't. I have a trip. I have a work trip to Nashville, like that. I think that coincides with a few of those dates. So.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I want to go. I could let my company know that I'm no longer interested in doing my job, and but yeah, I wish I could, but I would like to get back up there soon. But it was great talking, Shari, and to everyone who was joined us. I did have fun reading through the comments. I wasn't as engaged with them as I normally am, but
I think I was checking them out, and a lot of people were just talking to each other.
They're just doing their thing, which is awesome.
Let them talk to each other. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
See ya.